we'll start where there are now 7 of us in one cell in a jail, in the WWII jail, at a base not too far from where we were shot down.
All right.
Okay.
And you're in what country?
I'm in Germany, central Germany. Probably, maybe a little on the east side, but not about maybe 50 miles west of Leipzig.
And just for the record, this is on August the 10th, is this correct?
We got shot down on the 29th. We spent...
July 29th.
Yeah, July the 29th. Starting on the 30th, we were in this jail 8 days. My pilot and co-pilot and a fighter pilot were in the jail at the Luftwaffe base for 8 days, starting July 30th.
July 30th. This was a jail operated by the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
It was not a civilian jail.
It wasn't a civilian jail, no.
Okay. During those 8 days, why did they have you there 8 days, and what happened during those 8 days?
I'm not sure why we were there that long. I got word from one of the airmen who joined us in the cell a day or two after we got there that there were as many as 40 bombers shot down that day.
Out of how many?
Oh, probably out of 1,000, close to 800 or 1,000 bombers.
Okay.
Anyway, I think there were, must have been 4 of them joined us, brought it up to 7 of us in there. And they were all from one other bomber crew. And part of their crew had gotten hurt bad enough that they were in hospitals, the pilot being one of them, and I don't know who else.
Who were the 7 who made it out of... Did I understand you correctly? There were 7 people in your aircraft that made it out?
No. In my aircraft, there were 2 of us got out. There were 9 people on board, and 2 of us got out.
You and who else?
And the co-pilot.
And the co-pilot.
So the co-pilot and I, and along with a fighter pilot, a P-41, let's see what one, P-47, a P-47 fighter. He got picked up. He managed to land his plane. They'd shot up his oil lines and he'd lost all of his oil pressure, so he was forced to land. He was brought in by himself and joined us the first night after we'd been captured while we were still in the jail. They moved us to a place in the jail where they could try to do a little grilling us for information. They wound up just deciding to feed us, and they had a big canister of soup, an insulated steel canister with a lid, and the soup was still nice and warm. It'd probably been prepared for lunch or something, maybe early in the morning, but we got there and they brought it out for us and gave us each a bowl and a spoon and the dipper. I don't remember which one of us went up there first, but I think I did. Went up there with my bowl and got the dipper and dipped me up a bowl of soup. And I saw those flies floating around on top of it, but I just kind of pushed them back out of the way and got my soup. Well, the other 2 guys came up and looked into it and saw the flies floating around. They decided they weren't hungry for soup. So I sat over there in the corner and drank my soup, and they didn't get anything that night.
Well, here you were, a 21-year-old.
By this time I was 21 years old, yeah.
You're in a military, so to speak, jail.
Yeah.
In combatant country. You survived an airplane being shot out of the sky, one of the 2 lucky ones. And at this point, what were your main concerns?
Our main concerns were more or less, where are they going to take us, and what are they going to do to us on the way to getting there?
Did you have any reason to fear for how they were going to treat you? Had you seen other people treated badly or heard of other people being treated?
No, we really hadn't. We had heard that if we evaded, if we didn't get caught, slipped around and they didn't catch us for a while, that we could be charged with espionage or sabotage or something. But that wasn't the case with us, so we weren't going to get any real bad treatment, we thought. But the interrogations might be pretty rough, but probably no physical harm would come to us.
Well, how did it turn out?
It turned out just like we hoped that it would. We all stuck it out with name, rank, and serial number. They had all kinds of questions to ask about what group are you in, and trying to lull us into thinking it wouldn't matter if we told them such innocent things as that. And we just stuck with the word, name, rank, and serial number. And they would get upset at us, or they'd make believe they were upset with us. I don't know which, but they put on a pretty good show for us. But they did that at the Luftwaffe jail. They took us in and interrogated us a while. But they didn't get rough, never did get rough. And we all just stood our ground and went back into the cell. And anyway, at the end of 8 days, they got us ready to go catch a train at night. And they sent a guard with us, of course. I can't remember exactly, but I think that by that time, the other 7 people that were being held at that jail were put with us, and we all went to a waiting station, some benches that were out around a railroad station that was nearby.
This was a civilian railroad station?
Civilian railroad station. There were the 7 of us out of the cell, out of our cell, and then there were 7 out of another cell or some other part of the jail. And we all boarded the train together and traveled to Frankfurt. A little aside, while we were there waiting on the train, it was probably an hour, some French forced labor people came up, and they wanted us to sing the Star-Spangled Banner together.
Oh, well, did you accommodate them?
Yeah, we come together. We all accommodated each other. So they were very friendly folks. By the next, about early afternoon, we arrived at Frankfurt train station. By this time, they had brought in a lot of guards, and we wondered why we had. I think there were 14 of us, and I believe we had 8 guards with the 14 of us.
A lot of guards.
Yeah, we thought that was strange that they'd had that many guards, but we got into the bus, and that was to take us to the interrogation center. They told us on the bus that the reason that they doubled up on the guards was because that 2 weeks previous, there were about 10 or more British airmen were brought to that train station, and the civilians overpowered the guards, got the English airmen, and hung them. So they didn't want anything like that to happen to us. They wanted to get us on where we were going.
Well, I wondered if that wasn't what you were leading to, and I wondered when you said you were at a civilian railroad station if there was any hostility expressed towards you by the civilians who might have been around.
No, the only time that we got hostility from civilians was the day that we got shot down. And they brought us together, brought the 2 of us together, the co-pilot and me, brought us together in the field. And
these were civilians?
Civilians,
okay.
Yeah. And by that time they sent a policeman out from the local town to bring us in to the jail. But on the way into the jail, the civilians that weren't out in the field working, there must have been about 20 or 30 of them, were standing along on either side of the road that we had to go, this pathway we had to go, and spitting on us and yelling at us. But that's the only civilian mishandling that we got.
So they put you on a train in Frankfurt and took you...
Well, they put us on once we got to Frankfurt, they took us off the train and put us on a streetcar and sent us to the place where we were to be interrogated. It was a center that was put there just for that purpose, to interrogate airmen. And it was not large. It was the building that had the cells in it. It was all solitary confinement. And as far as I know, they didn't have anybody there except the 14 of us.
So up until this point, you had been in community. You were with the other 13, and
Yeah.
you could freely talk among one
Yeah.
another. And then when you got to this interrogation center in Frankfurt, what was that like?
Well, it was a wooden structure, as I remember, with a long hallway and cells all along one side of that hallway, and the other side was windows. For the cells, there were no windows except a peephole out through the door where we could see out into the hallway, and where they pushed a small meal to us. But they took me, and that's all I can really speak for. They took me out 2 or 3 different times with different interrogators to ask me questions about where we came from, where we were based, what squadron, how many planes, what was our target, and all that sort of thing, which we stone-faced them and just told, or I did, I think everybody did, name, rank, and serial number. And that was day 1. Day 2, they started out doing something similar. I think I was interrogated 2 more times, and one of them was by a guy who gave me the story that his uncle had been killed by the Nazis, so I didn't have to worry about him because they'd killed him for being in on a plot to kill Hitler. And there had been this plot where you remember
Right.
the explosion?
Yeah.
Well, he was telling us that his uncle was involved in that and was executed. So I could talk to him. Well, of course I didn't, but it made a good story.
I bet it did. So you were there how long?
I was there about a little over a day.
And during the time that you were there, how did they treat you?
Civilly. They might growl at us or something like that, but we were treated pretty well.
When you left there, I'm assuming you went from there to
Well,
someplace.
we went there, just a little aside in this, that when I was let loose, when I was taken out of that cell, told to go over and take a shower in another wing of this building, most of the other 13 guys were out there and had their showers, and it gave everybody a razor and we could shave and all that sort of thing. And clean up, issued us some clothes. I'd been going around barefooted all that time. I lost my boots when the parachute popped open. So anyway, got some shoes and some different clothes and a little suitcase and some toiletries. Anyway, I got over there with them, and they were talking about what they had experienced, and all of them swore that they hadn't yet divulged anything. There was one young guy that got kept another night, and they wondered what he'd been saying. But anyway, the next day they put us on a train and sent us toward Berlin. We were in, I guess it was just a civilian type train. All of the seats were slats, backs and everything. And there was a place where we could put our luggage up above us in a rack, but no beds. We were actually on that train for 3 days.
While you were on this train, did you meet up with other captured?
Yeah. The train, I don't really know how many people were on it, but my guess would be that there were probably 50 on the train. We were all headed for northern Germany. The first night, we pulled into a railroad station and the air raid alerts, sirens went on. And all of our guards left the train and went to shelter and left us out in this marshalling yard. And we knew that one of the big targets of that part of the war was to blow up all the rail facilities, particularly at a marshalling yard. So we didn't know whether we were going to survive the night or not. And the same thing happened to us the next night. I think it was on the 3rd day we got up to the prison camp, but we did go through Berlin on the way. And there was an alert while we were there.
At any point along the way, had you met with or had any contact with the Red Cross or?
No. As close as we got to the Red Cross was that when we got to the prison camp, they had us fill out papers, our name and rank, serial number, and several other pieces of information they wanted that we didn't give. But anyway, I had to give away a little bit of information, because if you wanted your parents to be informed that you had survived and were in prison camp, you had to give them your parents' name and address and all. So I did that, and this went to the Red Cross. The Red Cross handled the messages.
Was this information taken by
Germans?
By Germans, with the idea that it was going to be transferred to the Red Cross?
Yeah.
Well, does that take you up to the point where you're at the prison camp?
At the prison camp, yeah.
Well, if you wouldn't mind, describe where in Germany this is and the name of the prison camp.
This prison camp was on the Baltic coast of Germany, and it was about 1 or 1.5 miles from a little city called Barth. And the state that it was in was what we'd call Pomerania, but they called it Pommern. And we were about 60 miles south of Sweden, all of that across water.
All right.
Judging by the serial numbers, they had more than, or at least they had as many as 5,000 prisoners of war there, mostly all airmen, in that camp who'd been there anywhere from a big part of 1 year to 2 or 3 years. And most of these people were Americans, and they'd gotten there in the last year, probably in '43.
And when you arrived there, how did you get settled into some semblance of a normal day-to-day life?
Well, they took us to the compounds. The camp had 3 compounds, I believe it was then. And they took us to a compound where the barracks were all full. They were all occupied. And these were 1-story long barracks.
In August?
In August, yeah. Early August. Maybe mid-August. There were no rooms available for us, but they had put up tents just outside of these barracks. And they had components to make up wooden double-decker beds. They had slats for the bed, and the mattresses were bags of Excelsior wood shavings. They gave us bed parts to put together, and they gave us the mattress, and they showed us where the pile of Excelsior was so we could stuff our mattresses with it. And then we were home. That was it.
What types of routines could you count on a daily basis for food and human, just creature comforts, food and shelter and toiletry facilities and shower and, just taking care of just basic hygiene and feeding yourselves?
This camp, as I told you, the one we were put into, was full and had been in existence long enough that they had a mess hall set up there, which was a permanent building, and they had cooks and everything, the American airmen that were cooks and that prepared the food, and we just went over there 3 times a day and got a meal until they finished building the compound that we were supposed to move into next door. And that took a big part of a month, but in the meantime we ate in this mess hall. There were latrines. There were actually bathhouses, but there weren't any shower baths. They were just commodes and lavatories in a freestanding building that wasn't a part of the barracks, and they weren't a part of the mess hall either.
Was there any fear for your life? Did you ever, I'm wondering if by the time you reached these barracks and got settled in, was there any reason to fear for your well-being other than were you going to get enough to eat? And were you going
No, there wasn't any feeling. We knew that if we tried to escape or something that we'd probably get shot, but other than that, no.
Outside of eating and taking care of whatever duties you had with constructing your own beds and getting moved into your own quarters, what did you do to occupy your hours?
Well, I believe the YMCA had furnished sporting equipment. They'd furnished balls and bats and gloves and footballs and basketballs and volleyballs and that sort of thing, so that there was plenty of opportunity to play games and kill your time. And by the way, at that time of the year in northern Germany, it was fairly pleasant. We were getting up close to the Arctic Circle, close enough that the sun was way down there. And this grounds that we were in was all sand, and it was kind of like being on the beach. Everybody was getting a tan, not had any opportunity to do much except fly and get ready to fly and try to get a good night's sleep every night. Went back at the air bases, so this was everybody's opportunity to sit out and kind of get a tan. So it was kind of funny to see them. Nobody was lying down on their belly to get a tan. They were propped up like this so that the sun would hit their chest and legs.
Oh, so they could face the sun on the low horizon.
Yeah.
I got you.
Of course, this
you get more of a sunburn on the bottom of your feet that way.
Yeah.
You hear stories that it's always a combatant's duty to try and find a way to escape.
Yeah.
How did that play out?
All right. Well, that played out that by the time we got there, the jig was up. That was over, because the guys that had been there for the year before had dug all kinds of tunnels and almost escaped. I think 3 people finally escaped, and all but one of them was captured. And they shot some people also for getting loose and then being shot. They shot them down. So there were some killed, and a new commandant came in, so the story goes, and he was pretty good with radio equipment. He rigged up so that they could tell by the sounds that he could pick up with this radio system that he'd put out outside the fence, that they could tell when somebody was digging a tunnel, and they would monitor it daily and see how much progress. And then when the day came that the night came that the people came up out of the ground, burrowed their hole up to the surface, it would be ringed with the guards who'd kick them good and take them back to the compound. So it got to be a very futile thing. There were some people that were killed trying to get over the fence, but they were single individuals. There weren't too many of them.
So anybody that got the impression of what it was like to be in a German prisoner of war camp from watching Hogan's Heroes on TV didn't really have a very good idea what that.
No, they didn't.
All the commandants were not stupid.
That's right.
And
it wasn't a game.
Were there wounded in this prison? What kind of medical facilities did they have, and how did they take care of people who may have been wounded?
They had a little field hospital where they took care of people. It seemed like the practice that the Germans had, if you were wounded badly, they'd put you in a hospital, get you to where you could travel.
Yeah.
And you might still not be completely healed, but they'd put you in the prison camp to finish your recuperation. I had one close friend that I got acquainted with who was a fighter pilot, had gotten shot down, and I think he burned a leg pretty bad getting out of his plane. Even though he evaded and got with the French underground, he never really got healed. The Gestapo were the ones who caught him being sneaked out of the country. They were almost to the Spanish border in France. Anyway,
in the Pyrenees Mountains, or
yeah, he was about to go into the Pyrenees and get across, and they got caught. And there was a girl who had helped him. They'd fallen in love. She was part of the underground. He was in the same room with us from the time he got there until the war was over, and he never told us anything other than that he'd gotten caught trying to get out through the underground. And during that time, he was beaten again and treated pretty. They acted like he was a saboteur rather than being an airman, and treated him pretty roughly. Didn't give him much treatment for his leg. But finally, I guess they decided they got all the information out of him they could, so they had to recognize him as an airman and a POW. And they put him into a hospital, and he recovered from his leg injuries. And then they sent him on to us. So it seemed that the practice was to get them where they were ambulatory and healing before they'd bring them to the prison camp.
Well, I would think that in that point in time in Germany that just about everything was being rationed, and it was it must have been difficult to get medical supplies
Yeah,
rationed out to these prisoners of war.
yeah.
Tell me about food. You've told us, I've heard a lot of these stories when I was kids, but I think it's pretty interesting to know what they gave you to eat.
The mainest thing that they gave us was the boxes that came in, boxes of food, cigarettes and stuff that came from the Red Cross. We got a Red Cross box for months after we got there. We got a Red Cross box, each one of us, each week. And it had such things as a little can of peanut butter, a tin of Spam, 5 packs of cigarettes, razor blades, and sometimes razors, crackers. We could have lived on what they sent, but the Germans
Really? Could have just about lived.
we lived pretty meagerly, but we could have survived on what they were sending us. But the Germans, for most of the time, well, I guess all the time, on bread, they gave us started out giving us about a half of a loaf of bread. It was dark, hard bread, tough bread. It had a sour taste to it. It was a little bit gummy and had a sour taste, and took a while to get used to. But anyway, over time they cut back to where we were down to a quarter of a loaf apiece. It went from a half to a third to a quarter of a loaf apiece a day. And they gave us things like potatoes and cabbage. From time to time we'd get some beef. One time I remember particularly, they gave us a keg of beer for the barracks.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They had a radio loudspeaker in the hallway. They were the ones who decided what we were going to listen to, but I guess we were all hooked up on the same circuit. It was mostly German stations playing music, sometimes give some war information in German. We had an underground newspaper that was published in the camp. It was usually a one sheet, maybe sometimes two, printed on both sides, sneaked into the barracks right at the time they closed the barracks down for the night.
Where was this newspaper printed? How did that happen?
It was probably printed at night during the time that the barracks were all locked down, and we hardly ever had any German visitors during that time. We couldn't get out and they didn't come in. I guess they'd print it one night and send it out to us the next afternoon to be circulated in the barracks. There was one piece of paper that went to everybody that was in the barracks.
But there were multiple copies of this piece of paper.
But there's only one copy that went to each barracks.
Did they print it by hand, or did they have some kind
They had
of
a typewriter. They used a typewriter.
A typewriter.
Yeah. There was an office in each one of the compounds where the senior American officer was housed, and he had a little office. I just imagine the typewriter was there.
How did you get a sense for how the war was progressing, whether it was going in favor of the Allies or against the Allies, or what clues did you have for how the war was
We got a good picture of it every night in that newspaper.
And where was that information coming from?
After the war, they said that it was coming in to a radio that was under one of the toilet seats. Now, the toilet seats were a multi-hole plank.
Okay.
And apparently somebody put a radio receiver under there. Maybe they ran some wires out to the roof where they could pick it up easier. But they got BBC News and printed it.
Okay.
The Allied forces were racing across France. And we had about up to a week better information than the Germans were getting on their radio.
And just to put everything in perspective, this July and August of 1944, when you were shot down and captured and taken to a prison of war camp, this was 2 months after the D-Day invasion in June of that same year.
Yeah, when we got shot down, there had been no breakout, no successful breakouts from the beachheads.
Everybody was still...
They were just up on some of the cliffs above the beaches, but they hadn't made much penetration by that time.
So when you were in this prisoner of war camp and you kind of got settled into a daily routine, and you knew that your life wasn't in any imminent danger unless somebody did something out of the ordinary. Did you have any sense for how long that this was going to go on? Did you think that you were there for months, years, weeks? What did you think?
My guess would be that we were going to be there a year.
And you were there pretty close to that.
Yeah, 9 months.
Did conditions hold up during that 9 months in the way that you mentioned the rations of bread were cut down? What other changes in your daily living happened?
Well, nothing significant happened until right after Christmas of 1944. Then they started, I can't remember exactly, but I don't know whether I think they gave us rations maybe every other week or something like that rather than every week. They cut back on the, beef and cabbage, and we were getting a lot of frozen potatoes, and we were getting a Red Cross box each. I wish I could remember exactly the interval, but it wasn't weekly anymore. It was cut way back.
Were the potatoes frozen because the weather was changing, or because that was how they stored them?
No, because the weather was changing.
Okay. So as you got into the winter.
Yeah. There were things like kohlrabi, another root vegetable that we got, and cabbage and potatoes. And I don't know that we got any cabbage that fall, that winter. Can't remember whether or not we got any beef at all. Maybe some soup. Oh, I know what we got. We got dried vegetables.
To make soup with?
To make soup with, yeah.
When you got there, you estimated that there were 5,000 or so.
Something over 5,000, yeah.
What did the population grow to over that 9-month period?
Grew to about 9,900, somewhere in that. I read that in a book.
Did the accommodations grow in proportion?
Yeah. We were the third compound that had been built there. And then they built another compound beyond us. And then they, instead of having double-decker beds, they had triple-decker beds. Instead of having 8 people in a room, they had 12 people in a room.
Did you ever get the impression that the whole Allied Army was in a prisoner of war camp someplace in Europe and there was nobody left out there fighting the war?
No, we were getting, that was the nice thing about our daily newspapers. We knew that it was, well, let me step back a minute. We were a week in a jail. We were better than half a week probably at this interrogation center. We were 3 days on a rail cars. So, not much time, but some time went by between the time we got shot down and the time that we got to the prison camp. And when we got to the prison camp, they were telling these glowing stories about Patton and his army with tanks going across the...
Coming up Italy?
Going across... They'd broken out of the beachheads in Normandy. And they were coming across France and heading toward Germany. We wouldn't believe it, the ones of us who were newly in, until it just kept going on. And then the Germans began to pick it up in their newscasts. So, no, there was hope from the day we hit the prison camp.
Pam Lawless is going to ask a question.
The radio that was hidden, was that something that you traded for with some of the German guards?
Yes. I don't know whether they just traded for components and put them together, or they actually got a little receiver purchased. I never did hear that part of the story.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
I'm sure they wouldn't trade you anything that you could use to harm them.
Yeah,
but
right.
That's interesting that they gave you the parts and the pieces so that you could almost have like an underground city going there.
Yeah. It kind of was a little city in this respect that each compound had its own senior officer who had an office and held meetings, talks to the troops. After we got counted, we were all outside in the ranks. If they had something to say to us, made some announcements. They were responsible for our behavior.
The senior officer?
The senior officer. If a higher ranked officer came in, he became the senior officer. They sent out...
And they had an office?
Yeah, had a little office in one of these barracks that the Germans knew about and provided them. And there was a library, and that was nice. When I first got there, it was mostly English poetry and English novels and that sort of thing. And, they're so-so. And then later, we began to get American novels and American books.
What was the purpose behind the Germans facilitating the prisoners' maintenance of military rank and order?
I think it was a way of delegating some of the control that they had to have over the individuals.
You got 5,000 to 9,000 people out there. They're going to need some help in just maintaining a semblance of order.
Yeah.
During this 9 months, it sounds like you were getting information about how the war was going. At what point did you realize that this may be coming to an end, that there may be a break here, or not a breakout, but that things were going to change?
When the Americans got into Holland, I guess, it looked like it was going to go until they got to one bridge too far.
Yes.
When that happened, our hopes kind of died for a little while until they could break out again and get going.
You spent the Battle of the Bulge period in a prison war camp, if I've got the timeline correctly.
Yeah.
Was that included in this, the depression and maybe feeling of how the war was going?
Yeah. We've got the first notice of the Battle of the Bulge, or that they've been encircled there in a snowstorm. We got that in the German papers. I forgot to mention that about once a week we'd get a German newspaper, and there were enough copies that everybody got to read it. And I can remember the picture of the battle zone that the Bulge was in, and best I remember, it was a scene of some American troops, and overhead there was a German airplane. So we thought, well, boy, this isn't good news. So that was a kind of a drop in our hopes there. Toward the end of the war, after we realized that the Americans were covering a lot of ground, the Americans and British were covering a lot of ground in the South, and that they'd taken Paris and all that. Then we began to hear more about the Russians coming through Poland, and we'd get a daily update on where the Russian front was.
Were there any Russian prisoners, military or civilian, in your prison?
Not in our prison, but just across the road from us. There was a Russian prison camp. We found out later there were some French that were in a forced labor camp that was less than a mile from us.
Tell the story of the week or the days leading up to the time where you were liberated from this prison.
Well, as I said, we began to hear about the movement of the Russians coming across Poland on the Eastern Front. Then we hadn't been getting those stories very long until we could hear the cannon fire in the distance. There were big explosions. It seemed like that they were getting louder and coming closer, and we even got to the point where we'd go out in the compound before they would shut us down for the night in the barracks. We'd go out and shout, "Come on, Joe." Germans figured out who we were talking about, and they said they'd shoot us if we kept doing that.
Joe Stalin.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we could hear them coming for about 2 weeks, 10 days, 2 weeks.
How did you feel about the prospect of being liberated by the Russians?
Some mixed feelings.
Why was that?
Because we knew how massive their forces were and how powerful. What a grudge they had against the Germans. We were afraid that we'd just get plowed under with the Germans when they came across our part of the country. Our officers told us, they kept us kind of posted, our senior officers kind of posted on what was happening. And one of the things we heard was that some of the German civilians were committing suicide as the Russians got closer.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Were these true?
Yeah, they turned out to be true. Almost within sight of our camp fence toward the city of Barth, there were people that were coming across that field, probably about a quarter of a mile away. And we got the story that 3 women with babies in buggies went out across that way and committed suicide and killed their children. Now, some of this we don't have any way of knowing whether it was true or not. but there were German sources on it. By the time they got there, of course, all of the German military was gone. Our camp German officers and enlisted men left somewhere around midnight the night before the Russians got there. The story that I've read about it since then is that they had a big meeting for almost 24 hours time with our senior officers about how they were going to leave, and had an agreement that we would not pursue them or harm them if the Germans would leave peacefully. Our people wouldn't do anything to endanger them.
Okay. What was the situation like the day after? What kind of information were you given by the military command within the prisoners?
They told us to stay put, stay inside. The fences were still up. Stay inside the fences. The gates were open. We could get out and go down to the beach or something like that. But they advised us not to go into the little town of Barth. Told us we'd be better to just stay right where we are and not get out.
I'm supposing that's so it would be less likely you would be confused with anybody other than who you are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because the Russians had very little contact with Americans at all. So we weren't real sure they knew who we were.
Was there any contact with the Russians either by people sneaking out and making contact or radio, or was there any kind of contact with the Russians until they showed up at your camp?
None that I know of. Within the first 24 hours after they came through, our officers went out and were looking for the Russian senior officers to let them know that we were there and that we were going to stay put. The Russians didn't like that at all. They wanted us to leave. They weren't going to harm us, but they wanted us out of there.
Why?
I guess they were afraid we might join the Germans in behind them or something. I don't really know why. There's a good rendition of this in a book that was written by a man who later became a professor at LSU.
Okay. Do you know the name of that book?
I think I've got the book back there.
Okay.
But he gave the inside story about what happened between the American senior officers and the German senior officers.
Was he one of these senior officers?
No, he had some real close contacts with